Turn out to the latest business news. Stephen Carroll joins us. Stephen, we've been talking about this earlier in the edition. It's now 6 months since France went into lockdown. A move, of course, that had huge economic consequences.
I mean, overnight you had massive sectors of the economy that just completely shut down as all but essential shops were ordered to close. We had 2 months of that strict lockdown, but even as measures were eased, we've seen some sectors not recover from that huge dent in their business. Tourism is a good example of that. It's 7% of France's GDP annually. When you think about the fact that international visitors disappeared essentially overnight, that's a sector that still hasn't seen the key market of Americans or Asian visitors return to Europe this year and return to France in particular. So that's a sector still suffering 6 months on. It was a seismic shock for the French economy, and we saw it borne out in the economic figures almost immediately. Economic figures are divided up into quarters of the year. So the period from January to March, only 2 weeks of that included lockdown, but there was still a nearly 6% slump in economic activity over that 3-month period. The following 3 months, of course, saw the worst because it covered most of the lockdown period, a 14% slump in economic activity over in GDP over that period. For the whole year, it looks like now the French central bank says it's expecting the French economy to shrink by just under 9%. In fact, the finance minister this morning has been on radio saying he thinks it's going to be 10%. So some debate over those figures, but definitely the worst recession France has seen since World War II. The bounce back next year, the French central bank saying they're expecting 7% growth, but the scars of this crisis will last years in the economy.
So with that loss of economic activity, are we seeing an impact, a loss of jobs?
Well, so it's really interesting what the French government did in this area, because right at the start of the pandemic, they extended their furlough or partial unemployment scheme to all employees. And that essentially meant the government could step in and pay the wages of private sector workers that were unable to work during this crisis. It was a hugely important step taken to maintain jobs and people's incomes. The end goal to try to keep consumer spending up. Consumer spending, the most important driver of the economy, and this is how the French government sought to limit the worst effects of this crisis on French businesses. At its peak, the scheme was paying the wages of almost 9 million public sector workers. Today, it's still in effect for over 2 million people in France. It's been extended until November 1st, with employers incrementally taking over more responsibility for the scheme. Still a small percentage, though, the state's still bearing most of the bill. The cost is absolutely huge. You're talking about more than 30 billion euros, and those costs will continue for many months to come.
But is it at least saving those jobs?
It did largely what it was supposed to do. It maintained people in employment while businesses were closed. Now, there were still job losses during this period. In the first half of the year, 650,000 net jobs were destroyed. So that's job losses minus job creation. 650,000 jobs went. The latest forecast from the National Statistics Office say they expect unemployment to reach 9.5% by the end of 2020. That's up from around 7% now. And the expectation from the French central bank is that rate will continue to rise in 2021. And again, that's as businesses will realise, despite the government support, that some of them simply cannot go on. So this situation may get worse before it gets better.
One of the sectors worst affected by the pandemic, you mentioned it briefly, was tourism and notably air travel. In France, it's raising questions about proposals on a new tax on that industry.
So the government's looking at plans to dramatically increase the environmental levy on flights. It's a topic that's divided opinions among ministers here, who fear that a big tax increase would hurt a sector already in crisis. Catherine Viette has the details.
For a sector already battered by the pandemic, another worry, France's eco-tax. Earlier this year, the Citizens' Convention on Climate proposed a drastic increase to the current amount. Now set at €50 for flights less than 2,000 kilometers, it could go up to €30. While on long-haul flights, the change would be from €3 to €60. That's an increase of 1,900%. It's a proposal that's divided the government.
L'objectif collectif, c'est de faire en sorte que l'aérien se verdisse. C'est pas d'achever un secteur qui est déjà à terre et par ailleurs de rendre ce mode de transport accessible qu'aux riches. C'est pas ça l'objet.
France's environment minister wants the debate to go forward.
Il donne son avis, sauf qu'à la fin, c'est la concertation qui va aboutir à un projet de loi. Voilà, il a le droit d'avoir son opinion.
The division worries environmental groups, which fear the government could end up scrapping the proposal.
Il est important que ce travail soit respecté et que l'engagement du président de la République à reprendre les mesures soit respecté et qu'on n'assiste pas à un assemblage d'autres jokers.
The airline industry is anxiously watching. France's Civil Aviation Authority says the revised tax plan would amount to 4.2 billion euros in annual costs for French air transport. It could also put more than 100,000 jobs at risk, according to this airline chairman.
Moins d'avions, moins de personnel dans les aéroports, moins de personnel chez nous, moins de personnel dans tous les métiers connexes, y compris le restaurant de l'aérogare. Donc il faut penser à tout ça avant de prendre des décisions.
According to some aviation experts, the proposed tax increase could spell the end for some airlines.
A quick check on the markets for you next. European shares taking a tumble at the open this morning. London, Paris and Frankfurt all down over 1%. This is after the Federal Reserve's statement that they would keep interest rates low until 2023, which seems to have disappointed investors in trading today. It was a similar picture in Asia earlier. Falls across the main markets. The Nikkei in Tokyo down 1.5%.
Well, finally from you, Stephen, Australia's Qantas has come up with a new plan to boost sales after the pandemic grounded most of its international flights.
Yeah, it's a 7-hour scenic tour of Australia by air. The flight will take off from Sydney. That'll see Uluru, Byron Bay and the Great Barrier Reef. The tour takes place in a 787 Dreamliner. So prices are beginning from 787 Australian dollars, which is around 490 euros. Passengers will also get to keep a pair of the airline's famed kangaroo pyjamas. This is all an effort to stem those massive losses that Qantas has experienced in recent months. Australia's strict quarantine rules have forced the airline to ground aircraft and to cut jobs.
Okay, I have to say I'm slightly disappointed we don't get to have a quick look at those
The
pyjamas.
Couldn't find the pictures.
Stephen Carroll, thanks a lot for that.